Hello and welcome to the Racial Equity webinar series. I'm Kinkini Banerjee, the Senior Coalitions Relations Manager at USBC, and I'm so glad to have you join us for this session. This bi-monthly series was launched with funding from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation as part of USBC's efforts to create and model a culture of inclusion, diversity, and equity. It's focused on building the capacity of the breastfeeding field in three principal ways. The first is to support personal equity learning journeys of our attendees at varying levels of knowledge, awareness, understanding, and readiness for action. Secondly, we also build the capacity for our network to apply an equity mirror, which means to view ourselves and our organizations and to examine our own internal structures, cultures, and policies to increase coalition effectiveness in governance and in coalition building. And thirdly, this series helps to build the capacity for our network to apply an equity lens to view the world, to inform and guide the design of our programs and strategies and activities to increase our coalition's impact. So we are very happy to have you with us today, and if you're not already a part of our racial equity learning community, I hope you will join today. This is an inclusive learning process that's open to our whole network of state, local, tribal, territorial coalitions, as well as all of our national partners, or anyone who's really interested in the first food field can join this community. So we have a webinar at, on the odd-numbered months. We have blog posts aligned with webinar topics. We have a discussion forum where we can, continue the conversation. And we also have a really terrific file library sharing system where folks can share things whenever we come across good articles, good resources, good tools, we share them on the file library system. So I really hope you'll be part of this. And this is how you join. So on the USBC website, www.usbreastfeeding.org, you'll see the tabs across the top, and one of them says News and Info. Click on that, and there's a section for learning communities, and you'll scroll down. We host more than 20 online learning communities on breastfeeding-related topics. So, it's open to all of our site readers. Go through the communities, find the ones that interest you, and join. It just takes a second. And the racial equity learning community is listed last on our list of communities. So you should see all of our webinar materials today are on our web page, and it's your email should have the link for it. Danae has chatted the link as well in your chat box, so you should be able to click on it directly. If you see, it's the www.usbreastfeeding.org/equity. That's the public face. If you're part of the learning community, you'll also find a way to get there. So during today's session, we will be keeping, a block at the end for a lot of discussion and question and answers, but this is our presenter has designed it in a way to, make it as interactive as possible given the virtual format. So we really hope that you will send your insights, your perspectives, and questions throughout the sessions. She will be asking you questions as well, so I hope we have really great participation today. So if you want to send us your feedback, questions, insights, here's how you do it. You should see a webinar control panel on the right of your screen. If you don't see it, it could be that it's minimized, so click on the orange tab and it'll pop back out. And if you scroll below the audio section, you'll see a tab for questions. Click on it and it'll open up a text box for you to type in. So definitely be sure to be using that. And during this session, if you have any tech issues, audio problems, please email office@usbreastfeeding.org, and our staff should be able to help you. Okay, and that brings me to today's topic, no recipes, just relationships. looking inwards to create a more just breastfeeding field. Often with fewer resources and greater needs as we work towards increasing access to quality and culturally relevant care for vulnerable populations, we might be tempted to look for tips and techniques that increase surface level diversity or well-intentioned efforts at equity. Unfortunately, using quick recipes or quick fixes, as enticing as they are, can build greater cynicism and decreases trust, not just amongst us, but also among the communities with whom we work. So during this webinar, Nanci Luna Jiménez will elevate our conversation around access, equity, and justice. We'll be invited to look inwards, personally and in our work, to grapple with the internal barriers and biases. We'll also look outward to name and understand systemic oppressions and their impacts. And we'll explore the importance of learning and emotional healing for ourselves and others. So as we collectively deepen our understanding of racial and social justice work, I cannot think of a better emphasis than the adjective just that Nanci is lifting up today. Just means fair. Just means equitable, even-handed, unprejudiced, open-minded, honorable, decent, honest. Just means moral. So let's participate fully today and learn how we can build and reestablish just relationships as the basis for renewing our commitment to increasing equity in the breastfeeding field. And I'm delighted to introduce our presenter for this session, Nanci Luna Jiménez. Ms. Jimenez is recognized regionally, nationally, and internationally for a highly effective and insightful training, inclusive facilitation, and dynamic speaking with groups of diverse ages, different domains and sectors, as well as cultural background. She founded the Luna Jiménez Seminar and Associates in 1994 to design and deliver unique programs that encourage individuals in their process of personal transformation, releasing individual initiative to create a more just and equitable workplace and world. Nanci's approach is, to diversity and social justice continues the legacy of trailblazers such as Dr. Erica Sherver Marcuse, who coined the term unlearning racism, and also Lillian Roybal Rose, who's a thought leader and veteran trainer in cross-cultural leadership. Nanci's approach empowers participants to take pride in their own heritage as a means of building alliances with others. Nanci has just such an impressive track record of international work that I couldn't possibly read it all, but I want to let you know that in 1995 she served as the international observer of the Haitian presidential elections. She's a Ford Foundation Fellow and candidate for doctoral at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She received a BA from Yale University, and she also attended the Universidad de Puerto Rico and the Colegio de Mexico in Mexico City. So of Puerto Rico and Chicana heritage, Nanci was born in Detroit and raised both in Detroit and Tucson. And when she's not facilitating and training, you can find Nanci doing the bamba, and it's an Afro-Puerto Rican dance and drum tradition. She does yoga, she lifts weights and trains for half marathons, and we are so very honored to have Nanci with us today. So I am going to turn it over to Nanci.
Thank you, Kinkini. I really appreciate the introduction that you were so generously gave of me this morning. And I want to welcome everybody to the webinar. I can't think of anything more just. I'm sorry, I'm trying to get rid of this webinar screen. Let's see if I can do that. No. I can't think of anything more just than first food for the communities that we all serve. And I'm really excited to be here with you today to bring you a perspective, a piece of teaching that I learned as a participant in a workshop from Lillian Roybal Rose some 23 years ago, and it's continued to be the focus of my life's work. And I'm looking forward to connecting it to the incredible work that you do in the breastfeeding community. So today's program is no recipes, just relationships. And, oops, I think we're having a little technical difficulty here. Maybe 1 second. Okay. Working. I go to the home screen. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Great, thank you. Yeah. Now we're on board. So here are some of the outcomes that we're hoping to cover with you this morning and this afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in. One is to understand how to shift frames of reference. And this is a really important part of the work. Whenever we're doing work that is based on equity and justice, it's very easy to understand people who come from our own frame of reference. It doesn't matter whether we're in a position of power or not. And so the challenge is really, how do we shift out of our own frame of reference? In other words, the ways in which we know the world, our value system, and the value systems of our communities, to truly understand someone from a different frame of reference. And we'll talk more about the difference and dominance in there. Secondly, we're hoping to learn how to communicate across difference and dominance. And what does it mean to have respectful, dignified, just, heartfelt, compassionate communication, which we believe is the basis for relationship building, and relationships being the place from which social change and justice can come from in a sustainable way. We also want to help understand the difference that same does not equal fair, and this is some of the confusion around using interchangeably language like equal and equitable, which are not the same thing, and we'll explore that a little bit more today as well in the webinar. And finally, two more, we want to explore why context matters when it comes to equity. And this is to sort of debunk the common phrase that is spoken in the U.S. that what's good for the goose is good for the gander, this idea that's what's good for one, if I treat everyone the same, that must be what's fair. And if we can't understand that context impacts our understanding of equity, then we're not, and in the end, we can't have justice. Finally, we're hoping that you will feel energized and inspired as you continue your equity journey in whatever stage you're at and whatever part of the field that you're in. So I want to introduce you to a model. It's called the Scheme of Cognitive and Ethical Development, and it is a model that was developed as a student learning model. And I'm not here to teach you this model specifically, but rather to take some of its core concepts and apply them to the field of cross-cultural communication and understanding and equity work. So this model was developed by a professor named William Perry, and he conducted his research of students at Harvard University. And so from the get-go, I will say that there's probably a race, class, and gender bias in his research. But as I mentioned earlier, I'm not necessarily going to be focusing on teaching you his model per se, but rather pulling out some key concepts as we begin to talk and think through the ways in which we can communicate and understand people from different frames of reference than our own. So the basic overview of the model is that there's 4 stages. And the first stage, and sort of kind of poetically, they coincided with the 4 years that you might enroll in a traditional university system, which we know that doesn't necessarily correlate for everyone. But if you were, you would map on your first, second, and third year and fourth year of university studies with each of these stages. At least that's how Perry visioned it when he designed and developed this model. And what he found was that in the first year, he found that students tended to think dualistically. And we throw the term dualism around a lot, but I want to take a minute to just define what dualism means. So dualism is when you are coming from a fear-based position, and that's really important. Perry doesn't talk about emotions, but I think it's a piece that we can definitely add into our understanding now. And dualism is essentially when you're in good or bad, right or wrong, this or that type type of framework. It's either one way, it's either my way or the highway. That's a very dualistic statement. You're either part of the solution or you're part of the problem. That's another dualistic statement. And Perry, in all of his insights, he didn't talk about emotions. He also didn't talk about imbalances of power. And so we're going to bring both of those elements into our understanding, more importantly in our application of this model to understanding conversations, relationship building, and work that is motivated by justice. So fear, if any of you attended university, if you remember your first year in college, we were all afraid on some level someone was going to find out how stupid we really were and that we didn't deserve to be there. And so what we find in the first year of university for most students is a much higher elevated notion of fear, this flight, fear, freeze response that's happening for us. And so it's not a surprise then that we would be very concrete in how we would think about things. It's in dualism that we will project, for example, from our frame of reference onto someone else's. So you'll hear phrases when we're in a dualistic state, you'll hear phrases like, oh, how can those people eat that stuff? Or how can these people live like that? So that's a dualistic statement. So a dualism is a fear-based, rigid response. It's important to know that dualists see facts as evidence of truth, and there's only one truth, and that's an important element where you know that dualism is at play. There's one truth with a capital T. There's the idea that there's good and bad and that they're against each other, that they're oppositional, and that two opposing things can't both be held at the same time. When we're coming from dualism, we tend to also rely on authority figures for the truth. And so we'll look to someone with a higher degree or a title that is greater than ours. And certainly if we're needing to believe one person over another, we're going to default to the one with the higher authority in that relationship. When we come from dualism, we tend to think very concretely. We tend to, if you would, sort of count drops and be very specific in how we conceptualize concepts. And so it's not surprising that when fear was so elevated going into our first year of college that we had gone off to college to learn the truth with a capital T. And so that very much defines the way of thinking that Perry was able to identify among first year students at Harvard. The second year, what Perry began to notice was that a student would come back for a second year to take a class with the same level of authority, a PhD expert in the same field, and they would learn that they had a point of view or perspective or a set of facts or a truth that opposed or contradicted the experience that they'd had the first year. And so it was this moment of like, there's difference. So there's this idea that there could be multiple truths. And that is how we begin to define and understand the stage of multiplicity. And so in multiplicity, we have this notion that everyone's different, but there's no acknowledgement of power imbalances or certainly no naming of dominance. However, we are beginning to understand that there are multiple perspectives, and that's an important shift in our own development and understanding issues around equity and justice. Again, the trouble with this is that, of course, then now there's no real truth because all truths are seen on some level as equal and all perspectives become equally credible. The other component of multiplicity that you might recognize, particularly in the field of equity and social justice, is there's a liberal mentality. In other words, if it feels good and it's right for you, then you should do it. And if there was a time of, in the U.S. period where I could point to as a decade that would describe the liberal mentality, and there were many great things that came out of this decade for sure. I would say the 1960s, a bit of an anything goes mentality was very common in that era. And so there's definitely this emphasis that whatever your experience is the truth, and it somehow can't be discerned or assessed in any complex way. And also in multiplicity, there's very little personal responsibility or accountability. If I were to describe most institutions and organizations that I work with, like what stage the organization might be, I would say most organizations are in a multiplicity stage. And I say this a little bit tongue-in-cheeky, but it's sort of the stage of, oh, it's all great that we're different. Let's everybody have their employee resource group, and then each employee resource group can sponsor a fair. and we'll all have a potluck and share our ethnicities and our differences together. And that's a bit of a multiplicity approach to looking at equity and diversity. So I just wanted to ground that again in the field, coming back from Perry's model. The next two stages of this model are both contextual. And it's a little bit confusing because stage 3 actually has contextual in its title. But the important thing to remember is that these final 2 years, what Perry observed in the students that he was studying was these students were no longer projecting from their frame of reference, which we are doing in dualism. And in dualism, the projection is that anything outside of our frame of reference is abnormal or wrong or deviant. In multiplicity, we're projecting from our frame of reference. However, we're describing what's outside of our frame of reference as different and curious and perhaps a little bit still strange but entertaining difference. In contextual relativism and committed relativism, the final 2 stages of this model, what Perry observed was that students were able to get out of the context of their own experience and shift into another person's frame of reference. This is a huge cognitive shift, and I think it's really important and speaks volumes to the capacity for us as both allies, both wanting to be allies across difference and dominance, and also to win allies from a place perhaps of subordination, and here I'm talking structural, hierarchical exclusion based on oppression, that we understand and can shift out of our frame of reference into someone else's frame of reference. So I really want to pause and really let that piece of information, if you would, that a notion of being able to shift as a significant shift. And what Perry observed is that in the third year was distinctly different from the 4th year in terms of how this shift manifested. So in contextual relativism, we're able to get out of our own context and into someone else's. However, in contextual relativism, there was a way that the student, and of course this can also be true in our equity journeys, we get into the context of the difference and then we become the difference. We have this experience of blending and appropriating other people's cultural experiences and starting to think that, in fact, we're more blank, if you would, than the group is itself. We tend to use other people's experiences to fill our own lack of grounding, because in contextual relativism we find that we tend to not have a clear sense of our value systems and a clear sense of our own grounding. So how does this look for an example? There's a couple of examples that come to mind. I'm not sure how many of you are calling in from California, or if anyone on the call and webinar is familiar with a place called Santa Cruz, California, but I lived there for many, many years. And Santa Cruz, California, if you're not familiar with it, and this is going to figure prominently in the work because I learned to do this work in Santa Cruz, California from my mentor Lillian Roybal Rose. Santa Cruz is it's a little bit what we call the woo-woo capital of California. And how do I mean that? I mean that with love in my heart, that there are many alternative, certainly but when I was living there, what I considered very alternative movements that come through Santa Cruz. I very much was raised as a mainstream young person in Detroit, and so the experience for me at the time when I lived there of practices such as acupressure or acupuncture were very new to me. The idea of yoga, which has become a bit of my own practice, but still was a concept that didn't really connect to my lived growing up experience. And so when I say woo-woo, it's basically when people take the kind of like they miss the core of what the teachings are, and they sometimes take the external trappings, and then they sort of assume that's the kind of the center of the movement. And so when I was living in Santa Cruz, California, probably back in the 90s, something that was new and coming through town were the study of Eastern religions. And very often it would be challenging to walk down the Pacific Garden Mall, which is kind of the downtown center of Santa Cruz, and not see multiple posters and flyers announcing such and such of a guru who is coming in from India or from such and such ashram to share their teachings. However, after a while, I didn't have to look at the posters to know that a guru was coming to town or had been to town, because as I would go for a walk on the mall, I would see many of my friends dressed in saris. They were wearing bindis on their forehead, and when I would go up to say hello to them and ask them how they were doing, I'd say, oh, hey, how's it going, Sarah? And they would say, oh, no, I changed my name. Now my name is Sita. And I was really confused by this sort of absorption of some of the external trappings, if you would, of what they perceived as Indian culture. And so when I would be with my Indian friends and we would encounter this walking down the mall, you know, they would turn to me and say, like, Indians, we don't dress like that, we don't look like that, we don't talk like that. And there was this feeling when I would interact with some people who were stuck in contextual relativism, well, then I'm being, I guess, more Indian than you are. And that, of course, is one of the most challenging parts of this stage of contextual relativism, is that it seems and feels so progressive. I've taken the time to study about your whatever, fill in the blank, religion, community, culture, history, language. I've absorbed it so much that as a form of respect and honoring, that it's now become who I am. And while all of that is incredibly well intended, the impact is that there isn't a sense of grounding of who the person is for the most part in this stage. And when we take the trappings of people's culture, or the handles of their experience, whether it's dance or music or food or language, and we decontextualize it. And so this is that word contextual that's going to continue to play out through our webinar, and we basically decontextualize or divorce it from its own experience. We have now appropriated that, and we know that appropriation and paternalism, which I believe this is inherent in that, is one of the most powerful and painful forms of oppression that exists. And in this context, I'm speaking specifically about racism. I know that I had a very, very dear friend, and she's still my dear friend, I should say. She was very wanting to honor my Latina heritage, and she herself is white German from the Midwest. We have the Midwest connection together in common, but she really thought that by learning Spanish that would be a beautiful way to honor my background. And to know a little bit about my background, it's probably important to know that I was raised in the time when it wasn't okay to be bilingual. I'm not sure that it's still okay to be bilingual, but my mother was raised in the McCarthy era in the United States, where the emphasis was on being American above all else and downplaying any difference. And I wasn't raised speaking Spanish. I've had to reclaim that language for myself through years of shame and internalized sense of inadequacy and deficiency around that language, because that was the experience that my family and my community had by not speaking English coming as immigrants to the United States. And so my girlfriend wanting to honor me by learning Spanish was really beautiful, but it was also complicated. And so when one day she burst out in Spanish to share her surprise with me, I was very touched, but I was also like, it seems to come so easily to her off her lips, not with any of the struggle that I had internalized and was making my way through reclaiming Spanish. And then she announced to me that part of her program of learning Spanish, that she was now fluent enough that she was going to be going to live abroad in Mexico, actually, and she was going to be going to the same state where my grandfather's from, a state that I had never been able to visit myself. And so, of course, there was this part of me that was both excited for her, but also struggling, feeling like she was saying all the right things, but there was something that didn't quite feel right to me, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And then, of course, after she went to live and study in Michoacan, she came back and blew my Spanish away. She was incredibly much more fluent than I was, and she had learned to make tamales, and she was, completely immersed. She'd come back dating someone from Mexico, and so, she would tell me, I can eat chilies hotter than you can eat chilies, and I know how to make tamales better than you make tamales. And she's saying all the right things in a sense of honoring my culture and my traditions. And I swear the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up because I was so frustrated. Why am I feeling so ungrateful and angry, even as she's saying all these things that I would think are very, well-meaning and well-intentioned, but that really wasn't the impact. Because what she'd done is she'd taken the trappings of my culture and said that was all I was. And unfortunately, or fortunately, if you want to be Latina and Mexicana, you don't just get our great food and great parties and beautiful language and, I would say, amazing men. You also get to live below the poverty line and have substandard housing and really poor health outcomes and great health disparities and inferior education and you have to live in an environment of fear and targeting. And if you don't get the whole package, really then you get nothing at all. And when you do that, you make me and my experience of my community exotic, and people are not exotic. And that's the challenging part about this framing, is we get into the context of the difference and it feels so honoring and so right, but the impact is quite the opposite. And often it's people in contextual relativism that are the most challenging to reach as allies, because it keeps a somewhat of a safety net around having to look at why are they using, or I would say why are we using, because this model says that we all go through these stages. Why are we using other people's culture, other people's handles, if you would, to fill an emptiness or a void in us? And while I would say, and Perry would certainly argue that we go through all of these stages, there is something very specific about the trap of this stage for white people as allies on the issue of racism. This idea that they can embrace another culture is really often about filling a void of whiteness for themselves. If you ask a white person, what is your white culture? What does it mean to you? Most white people will have nothing to fill in that blank with. There's an emptiness, there's a disconnect, there's a lack of knowing who they are and where they come from. And so unfortunately, I would say that is the cost of racism for white people. And then that makes them, again, unfortunately, more susceptible or vulnerable to this stage of contextual relativism and becoming stuck in contextual relativism. And it's important that we realize that the part where we're getting stuck is it's important that we're getting stuck in that we want to understand that anytime we're stuck in contextual relativism, it's based in pain. This isn't about, at least in the approach that we do, this isn't about thinking that people are, malintended in here or in some way devious. There's real pain, there's real loss, and it is human. It's the human need to have a sense of belonging. And when that sense of belonging is taken away from us because of not being on the non-target side of racism, there's going to be a human drive or need to have a sense of belonging, and often contextual relativism will fill that. And so we have cultural appropriation as one of the key examples of both racism and contextual relativism in this model. So I'm going to just want to make sure that you know throughout that you can be sending questions. I know these are somewhat academic concepts. I'm hoping that the examples will help illustrate their application, and we'll definitely take some more questions at the end, but we do have Kinney and one of my colleagues, Melissa, standing by to take questions and make sure that I get them. So she's sharing them with me in real time. So I want to make sure that your learning is as deep as possible in real time as we're going through these concepts. And then definitely we'll take more questions at the end. So throughout, if I can answer them, please don't hesitate to use your chat box. So the final stage that I want to bring us our attention to is committed relativism. And again, committed relativism is contextual. In other words, we have the ability to get out of our frame of reference and to shift into someone else's context, which is key. And committed relativism, there's a really big shift that we're able to get into someone else's context, and we don't get lost in their difference. We recognize, hear, and understand them. And in fact, we're even willing to be moved by them. And in other words, we're so grounded in our value system. We're so clear about who we are and where we come from. And we're so clear that we're able to actually be relaxed, if you can imagine. We're willing to be influenced, not to the loss of our value system, but influenced to a place of understanding and compassion. When we're in committed relativism, we're able to make our choices and decisions and capacity for communication by gathering information and by making assessments. You see, when we come from dualism, the tendency is to rely on the higher rule or regulation, authority, policy to tell us how to think and what to do. Whereas in committed relativism, we're really using our best judgment with all the wealth of information that's available to us. And from that place, we then make assessments. We are able to incorporate many data points, many ideas, and many perspectives. We do allow that two opposing things could both be true, and so we're able to live with ambiguity, and there's a sense of harmony and a coexistence of different points of view, even as we are able to see that they are not all equal. And I think that's a really important distinction between committed relativism and multiplicity. In other words, they're all equal in terms of the human experience, but they're not necessarily all equal within systems of oppression and historical context from which we understand them. Finally, the last component of it is that we're able to keep a very personal and committed, clear connection to our own value system. So that's committed relativism, and this, in a nutshell, is Perry's model. And while Perry describes this as a very linear experience, obviously you get on the train at dualism and you get off the train at committed relativism, he definitely ascribes it to, if you would, an aging or maturing process. I would certainly take issue with that. I think that any one of us can be anywhere on the scale on any given day on any given issue, and our interpretation would be that it's the element of fear that's going to determine how dualistic we might be on this scale. So that's an important element to remember, and also the idea that this isn't such a linear path so much as it's more of a spiral or a circular path. And this is the part that can be really challenging, because once I perhaps have a perspective of committed relativism on a particular topic, the minute that I want to try and beat you up with my enlightenment, I've now become the dualist. In other words, it's a very fine line that crosses me back into a place of dualism. And that urgency or that need to make someone right or wrong, if you would, is really rooted in committed relativism. So it looks like we've had a reset of the talk. So I'm just going to quickly scan through these again so we can get to where we were. Okay, so as I was saying, it can take us right back to dualism. And so it's going to be really important that we stay aware of when we've started to cross back into dualism. And one of the ways that I use to gauge, if you would, the experience that I often will use to gauge is, am I able to stay connected? Am I able to influence even as I let go of outcome? And that's a really important, if you would, sort of gauge of where I am on the scale, the difference in my view between dualism and committed relativism. And now oftentimes people will hear us say things like let go of outcome as in a, I'm super frustrated, I'm out of here, you're on your own. And there's a really big difference between letting go and walking away. And the way that we describe letting go in this model, and I think it's really important to have that perspective, is that you're letting go while staying connected. That's what letting go means, is that I still care about you, I'm still connected, I'm still value-based in our relationship. It's not that we're always going to get along and we're always going to agree. It's that we can commit to never going away. And I can tell you in my personal experience of beginning this work, when I started working with Lillian, I was 26 years old. I was younger than many of the people that were in the room that she was training, and she had brought me along to work with her, and she, of course, was old enough at the time to be my mother, and we would struggle, not around race per se, because she's also Chicana, Mexicana, not around gender or sexism because we're both female, but around adultism. And although I was a full adult at 26, I still experienced the effects of what we call young adult oppression, which is that age between 21 and 30, of being devalued or dismissed for your point of view and not seen as a peer. And that was the place where we saw the oppression run between us. I remember asking her if I could come train with her and if she would travel, if I could travel with her and learn her model. And, you know, she often says to me, and we've often shared over the years in our workshops, you know, as I came up to her, she teaches this stuff. And yet her first thought was, I really wanted someone a little bit older. You're too young to do this work. And she describes it as sort of like a metaphorical pat on my head, like a very little condescending she was. And she said, well, you know, maybe when you get a little bit older, that was the idea. And so we definitely had our struggles around the young adult oppression in particular in our relationship. But the one thing that we committed as allies, and the one thing I would ask you to think about as you seek to perhaps embrace and recognize what it means to come from committed relativism in this equity work, is that we never go away. And so even though we struggled and we definitely had hurts and miscommunications and there was definitely a power imbalance in our relationship, the commitments that we made to each other was no matter how hard it gets that we would stay in there with each other. And this is a challenging time for us to do that. I think in the United States in particular, but I think globally, we really don't have the skill-based for building deeper relationships and how to hang in there with each other when things go bad. It's almost too easy to click a button and unfriend or block, or too easy to anonymously post things that are out of hurt and out of pain that end up separating us from people that we can't shift frames of reference, our own or others, if we're not in close with each other. And the relationship piece is going to be crucial as we do that. I have a dear friend who recently was sharing with me how she and her husband, she found out right after the election, he voted for a different candidate than the one she did. And it's been a great point of pain and struggle in their relationship. And she said with a great deal of confidence to me, she said, if I wasn't married to him, I wouldn't be with him right now. And in my head, I thought, wow, that is one of the most beautiful things about the institution of marriage, is that it's probably the one place where we're not related by blood, where we really do make a commitment to stick something out with each other and to figure it out. And I'm not saying the institution is perfect, but that element of I'm going to hang in there, we don't have a lot of models for that. And I think that's what we are going to need to really develop as a core skill set and a competency in any of the work that we want to do for each other out in equity. We want to do for ourselves and with each other, is how I would rather say that, around equity, if we're going to systemically and sustainably, from a place of compassion, eliminate all oppression. So this next phase of the webinar is, so how do you talk to a dualist? I want to really acknowledge that this isn't easy, right? This is someone who perhaps not only thinks differently than you, but perhaps even thinks that the way that you think or the way that you live is abnormal, is deviant, is wrong. This person may even have power over you and have impact on your life and on your family's life, on your community. These are the places where, emotions are going to run high. It's easier to talk to someone that we already agree with, or who we already trust. It's harder to have that conversation with someone who has a really different point of view than we do. And so there's a set of skills and ways of thinking that we want to walk you through about how to communicate across dualism and dominance and be able to stay connected while you do that. So there's a story that I want to share as sort of the basis for doing this conversation. Of how do you talk to a dualist. And it's going to take us way back into the 1960s, early 70s, when the Peace Corps was recruiting for volunteers on television. And this is a print ad of the same commercial. But the commercial essentially was, there was an empty glass on a table just like this, and the screen would simply show a hand with a pitcher of water come in and pour the glass to the halfway mark, just like you see there. And then you'd hear a voiceover. And the voice would say, if you think the glass, how do you see the glass, half empty or half full? Just as it says on the screen, if you see the glass half empty, then maybe the Peace Corps is not for you. Go on and do what you're going to do in life. But if you think the glass is half full, join the Peace Corps, right? And then they'd have the phone number and the address. This was way before the internet. So they would have a way to contact the Peace Corps. My guess is that any of you hearing this commercial or seeing this ad understand the key concepts that this ad is communicating. One of optimism, one of hopefulness, one of agency and empowerment, that you could actually make things go better because you're seeing something as potential, as possibility. And we would argue, if we were to take that understanding of this commercial or this ad, that would be a committed relativist understanding of this ad. In other words, you've taken a concept that's being described through a glass of water, and you've been able to abstract meaning out of that, which is a pretty complicated way of thinking, okay? It's not concrete thinking, it's abstract thinking, and it's ambiguous, and it's metaphor. If I were in dualism, and I would be reading this ad or perhaps watching this commercial, it wouldn't make sense to me. And I think it's really important to remember that. It's not that there's anything wrong with my mind. I'm perfectly smart. In dualism, however, when I'm fear-based, when I'm having a sense of being perhaps unsafe or scared, and that's somehow driving the way in which I'm organizing the information that I have available to me, I'm going to be concrete. I'm going to want to count drops. And drops are what I see in that glass of water, not half fullness or half emptiness. I just see drops. And so if you were trying to communicate to me, let's say if I were playing the dualist in this example, and you were trying to get me to see, oh, but do you see the glass as being half full? That's potential. And I would be like, no, I don't get the commercial. And you'd try, well, but can you see that there's opportunity there? No, I don't see opportunity. I see a half glass of water. Well, but if we were both on a stranded island and you had this sense of potential, and I'd see like, as a dualist, I'd be like, we'd both be on a stranded on the desert island, and we'd both die at the same darn time. In other words, ounce for ounce, drop for drop, it's the same amount of water no matter how you see it. And is the dualist wrong? No. Dualism is not about right or wrong, and that's really important to remember. In dualism, our perspectives are limited. In other words, I can only count drops. It's either this or that. In dualism, I can't imagine the million creative alternatives between this and that. I can only see this and that. But this and that are right. They're two of a million possibilities. The problem is I can only see those two. So no matter how much you try to communicate to me that there's opportunity and the abstract and the metaphor of this, I'm going to continue in a dualistic frame of reference, come back to counting drops. Ounce for ounce, drop for drop is the same amount of water. And you can see or imagine, I'm imagining that you can abstract how you might have had some of these same very conversations where you're on one level and someone else is somewhere else and you just keep missing each other. You just can't seem to connect in that conversation. And so it's really important to figure out where are we missing each other, right? Again, in frustration, it could be really easy to just be like, I give up. I don't want to try and have this conversation. You're illogical, right? We start to then sort of name call or dismiss someone who's stuck in dualism. And yet this work is very much about how do we turn towards that person? How do we understand the frame of reference that they're coming from and attempt to influence them, even as we validate and allow their experience to be real and valid for them? As my mentor Lillian would say, when where we are is harder than where we fear to go, that's when we'll make the shift. And I think that's true for all of us. So, how do you talk to the dualist? Where do you go? I'm going to tell you the answer in a story. It's a story about a little boy being driven to preschool by his dad. And on his way to school, it was his first day of school, he was pointing out the window as they were driving by this building. And the little boy turns to his dad and he says, "What's that?" And the dad looks out the window to see what his son is pointing at, and he says, very matter-of-factly, "That's the lumberyard." And the little boy says, "Oh." Well, the next day, the dad's taking the little boy to school. Again, they pass by this building at the very same point. The little boy points out the window and he says, "What's that?" And by now the dad knows what he's pointing at and he says, "That's a lumberyard." And this time the little boy says, "Oh." Well, the next day they're driving on the way to school, and again the little boy at that same moment points out the window, and this time the father says, "Remember last summer when we were in the backyard building that fence? And remember I told you that those boards that we were using to build the fence came from trees? Well, when you take down trees and you make boards out of them, you store them in a place called the lumberyard. So when you want to build a fence, You go to the lumberyard to get the boards. And the little boy said, oh. And the next day, when they were on their way to school and they passed by that building, the little boy said, look, Dad, there's the lumberyard. In other words, you cannot teach the abstract concept of a lumberyard without first relating to or connecting it to something that is concrete, the lived experience of the person that you're trying to connect that concept to. In this case, you can't teach the lumberyard until you relate it to the fence. The fence is that concrete lived experience of that little preschool boy. And without a way to relate it, the concept of lumberyard is never going to stick. It's never going to feel real. It's never going to be retained. And so it ends up being just this asking over and over and over, or even arguing about, I don't know what that is. I think you're making that up. That's not been my experience. And so in this work, and I really want to emphasize this here, how do you influence, when you're coming from committed relativism, someone who's coming from dualism? In this work, we would say that you listen. Listening is the most powerful political tool that you will ever learn. And it's not political in the sense of political parties or running for office. That's not what we talk about. By political, and this is a quote from Dr. Erica Shirova-Marcuse, you have the capacity to influence for long-term systemic change, where we can listen, we can hear the fence, and we can begin to relate concepts that are abstract to the person's lived experience. And so we cannot underestimate the power of listening. There's a beautiful quote that says, listening deeply is so close to feeling loved that most people don't know the difference. And there's something profoundly intimate and connecting that happens in the listening experience in and of itself. And we also can hear what someone's lived experience is and relate concepts to that. And so when I think about, how do we teach the concept of the glass half empty, glass half full? In this example, if you were going to relate it to my experience, you'd have to connect it to my lived experience. I can tell you there were 2 times in all the years that Lillian on her own, and then she and I together, and then me since she's retired, have done this example in countless thousands of workshops and sessions and keynotes. Only twice has someone been able to identify how to answer this question. And the first time was remarkable. I mean, it was so out of the box. I remember Lillian really, in her role, she was role-playing the dualist with a room of about 60 or 75 people. And this young man, he was a student at the university that we were training, and he stood up. He was probably on the back left side of the room, and he said, in your introduction, you mentioned casually that you're 50 years old. And I want you to think about your life like that glass of water. So instantly, I watched Lillian come out of role, and she was very much now connecting to him because he was connecting the abstract concept of the glass to her life. And then he went on to say, you talked about having young adult children, you talked about having aging parents, and he went on to sort of unpack, if you would, the metaphor, applying it to her life. That's how you teach the glass. That's how you teach the concept of the glass being half full and what it gains you. Have to relate it back to someone's lived experience. Anytime you're teaching reaching someone with an abstract concept, we need to bring it back to the lived experience. And listening and building relationships are the ways that we know to do that. I want to pause and make sure there's no questions at this time. Anyone has any that have come through?
Nanci, this is Kinkini. We do have a question about when you were going through the contextual relativism thing.
Yes.
So do you want me to ask it now, or do you want me to hold off until you get there?
No, let me go back and I can go back to the contextual relativism.
Okay. So this is Joy, who asked that I appreciate your explanation of the white person's whole when it comes to describing my culture. This is very insightful and valid. I do feel it's important for me to learn about other cultures as well, though, in order to be able to better understand the world and the people around me. So how can I be culturally informed without accidentally or inadvertently appropriating others' cultures to be my own?
Yeah, it's a beautiful question. Thank you for that, Joy. And I think it's actually critical to this work that we become involved and understand different cultural contexts. I think that the key difference is what is motivating you. So when we come from committed relativism, it matters that you come at it from an assessment versus a fear-based rigid response. And contextual relativism is coming from a fear of not belonging. So even though we've kind of labeled dualism as the fear-based response, the truth is there's fear that's showing up in different ways throughout all the stages. And ideally in committed relativism, we're able to have healed enough from our fear or had enough evidence to the contrary that we can then assess flexibly without fear. So I'm going to give a parenting example, Joy, and I hope this is a good one for you personally, but for many of us, we've either parented or we've been parented, and so we find that this is a great way to connect this model to a lived experience. So I'm going to set the stage for this example, and hopefully this will tease it apart a little bit more. My mentor, as I mentioned, Lillian, lived for many years just north of Santa Cruz in a community called Bonnie Doon. And it's forest up there, it's woods, it's just out of town, but it's another world. And her daughter was turning 14, and her birthday is in September, so it's always around the start of school. And what it turned out was that her daughter believed, from her frame of reference, that when she was going to turn 14, she was now going to get to have her birthday parties on some of the North Coast beaches in Santa Cruz County. So she announced this to her mother, now that I'm 14, and now that I'm in high school, it was the start of her high school year, coincidentally, she said, I'm going to have my birthday party on a North Coast beach. So let me tell you about beaches in Santa Cruz County. The municipal beaches, which is where she'd had her beach parties all throughout, they're in neighborhoods, so there's lots of families and people living around the beaches. As a result, they shut down the beaches at 10 o'clock. You cannot have any party go beyond 10 because there's a noise ordinance, and so we need to keep the noise down, so everyone has to clear out. The municipal beaches are well patrolled. There's no drugs or alcohol allowed. There's restrooms and other facilities. There's big pits for having bonfires, but in a safe and contained way. How would any of you feel about your 14-year-old daughter having a birthday party on a municipal beach? Well, if you're like any people in our workshops, there's a unanimous consensus that that is a good thing, and that would be fine. Now, let me describe a little bit about what the North Coast beaches of Santa Cruz County are like. They're down isolated Highway 1. So you have to drive out of town and drive down the highway. It's a beautiful view. For many parts of that's a scenic highway. But the North Coast beaches in particular in Santa Cruz County, you can't see from the road because you have to climb up cliffs and down cliffs to get to these beaches. They're magnificent and pristine beaches, and there's nobody for miles and miles and miles. There have been murders and attempted murders, rapes and attempted rapes. People live on those beaches. There's drug deals that happen on those beaches. So how would you feel about your 14-year-old having her birthday party on a North Coast beach? If you're like anyone in our workshops, I'm going to guess that you would say not a good idea. So we know the answer to the question is a no. And now I'm going to communicate how it would sound as it goes across the scale. So in dualism, it might sound something like this. What? You want to do what? Oh, no, you're not going to have your birthday party on a North Coast beach because I say so. No, porque yo mando, because I say so because I'm the parent, right? So very clear, using authority. It's a fear-based response. Do you want to get murdered and raped? Remember those stupid questions that you would get asked by your parents, you know, that didn't really have an answer? So that is, we're looking at a fear-based response. That would be dualism. Multiplicity communication might sound something like this. Oh, you know, it's just the start of her high school years. If I say no to this, there's just going to be power struggle after power struggle. Maybe this is the one I should give in on. Oh, but you know, I don't want her to get murdered and raped. And my gosh, did you read the newspaper and what happened last week on that beach? And well, but you know, if I start fighting on this one now, I mean, maybe I am being too strict. It was never helpful that my parents were so strict with me, and then I just want to rebel. You go back and forth in multiplicity until you just decide it's too hard. I don't get this out, I can't figure out what the right thing is to do. Often you'll resort and go back to dualism. the next two stages, again, they're going to shift frames of reference. In contextual relativism, it might sound something like this. Oh, that's a great idea. Oh my gosh, I have this brand new mini skirt that I could wear to the party, and I know they just opened this brew pub up the road. I bet they would donate, or at least, give us a discount on some kegs for the party. So this is the parent who gets into the context of the child and then becomes the child. In other words, they're not able to discern who they are in relationship to their child's frame of reference. In committed relativism, the communication might sound something like this. I totally get why you'd want to have your birthday party on the North Coast beach. I mean, wow, it's like there's not going to be any grown-ups around. You don't have to end at 10 o'clock. You get this, you can see that I trust you more, that you have a greater level of responsibility and freedom. And then these are some of the reasons why I'm going to say no. In other words, my role in committed relativism is to stay clear that I'm the parent. And as the parent in this dynamic, I'm supposed to put limits and guidelines on my 14-year-old. That's by definition what I'm doing. The difference is, and I want you to really hear this, the committed relativist said no and the dualist said no. So it's not what you're doing that's going to determine where you are on this scale. And that's the hard thing from the outside. The two behaviors look the same. But what does matter is how you got there. If you got to that decision or that behavior or perhaps that learning for yourself, joy of another group, from a fear-based response, then more than likely you came from dualism and multiplicity or contextual relativism. But if you came from an assessment, if it was relaxed, then we would say you came from committed relativism. A couple of the clues in committed relativism are twofold that you can notice in the communication. One is that when Lillian said no, or so when the parent says no or sets that limit or guideline, they don't shame her daughter. She doesn't shame her daughter for her frame of reference. That's really important. So even as she's saying no and she's setting a limit or guideline, she doesn't make the other frame of reference bad or wrong. It's perfectly normal for a 14-year-old to think they're indestructible. That's normal. It would be abnormal if she was fear-based, right? It's perfectly normal that she would want this level of responsibility and access that she didn't have. So that's what we want to really emphasize here. The other thing that lets you know that you're coming from committed relativism is that you don't expect the response to be one of eternal gratitude because you saved her from being murdered and raped. In other words, more than likely your 14-year-old daughter, if you set that limit, is going to be upset, is going to be angry, is going to feel thwarted, is going to maybe be upset or hurt. And then you don't then be upset at them for being upset. And so that's the other piece, is that their response to whatever the decision is a valid one. And we want to honor that as part of their frame of reference. So that's the key thing that we want to acknowledge here. The difference is what drives that decision for you. Now, let me just say that her daughter is brilliant and figured out that her mother would be fear-based. And almost before Lillian could say no, she said, remember Mrs. Johnson? You've met her a couple times at the grocery store. Well, I talked with her, and she has that house that fronts up on that really tiny beach in Davenport. Nobody knows about it except the locals. Well, I talked to her because, you have to walk by her house to get there, so almost no one goes there. Well, Mrs. Johnson said that we're totally welcome to use her beach and her bathroom and her fridge, so nothing will go bad. We won't get food poisoning or anything. And she's even going to let us use her phone. This was before there were cell phones ubiquitously everywhere. And I talked to my older brother, who's 4 years older, and he said he'll chaperone the party with some of his friends and make sure that we stay safe. So right there, her daughter was addressing all of the fears that allowed her mother, who was at this time coming from a dualistic framework, not from an assessment, but she was able in committed relativism to get to a place of making an assessment that this is one of the million creative alternatives between she's going to let her have a birthday party on a North Coast beach and get murdered and raped, or she's going to say no. Both of which are valid, but they're limited. In committed relativism, when we can come out of fear, we can entertain a million creative alternatives between the this and the that. And that was the important and key shift in knowing that she was coming from committed relativism. So even as Joy, you, and other white allies are engaged in the learning and connection and relationship building with people from communities outside of your own, which is critical and crucial, and I'm going to talk about that in just a minute, why context matters. It's also important that you know who you are and where you come from. It's important that you know that the motivation is not to find a sense of belonging or community because you aren't grounded or have a sense of belonging and community in your white group. And that's, I think, a big piece that's missing in any of the equity work. Again, it's not what you're doing, it's how did you get there? What was the process or assessment which got you to that place? So I hope that answers your question, Joy. I'm going to go ahead and move on. I think this next piece is also going to be connecting to you. Let's see if I can. I think I went too fast. Okay, so equality is not the same as equity and why context matters. And this is, again, going to come back to your point in just a little bit, Joy. So it's we often hear when we're looking at equity, issues of equity, that I treat everyone the same. And if someone says to me, I treat everyone the same, then I say, well, then you're a dork, because I treat everyone the same is only rationale for dorkdom. People come from different contexts, and we must be able to assess the difference to know what equity means in that context, which is not the same as equitable. Often people say, well, you know, the way to be fair is to treat everyone the same. But that actually is equality, but it's not equity. And let me see if I can give you an example to explain the difference. If you were visiting a sports arena or a concert hall or a place where large groups of people gather, a building that was built probably more than 10 or 15 years ago, you will often see in those arenas at intermission, you will see lines, not at the men's bathroom. The men's door is swinging freely, but the women's bathroom, the lines around the block. That's because whoever was building this building, and I'm going to hazard to guess that it was a man, thought in order to be fair, right, we need to be equitable, and so therefore we should build one bathroom. That's the line around the block for the women's bathroom. So in order to be fair, we should build one bathroom for the woman and one bathroom for the men. That's fair. That's equality. We would offer, but that's not equity because they didn't assess the difference. Then there was a study done, and they actually timed how long it takes a woman to use a bathroom and how long it takes a man to use a bathroom. Well, and this is not including makeup, hair, or changing children's diapers, okay? This is just the process of using a toilet. And what they discovered was that for a man takes 1 minute to use a bathroom, and it takes a woman 3 minutes to use the bathroom. So equity or fairness is actually 1 to 3. So if you want to have equal access for women and men in large arenas and sporting events to use the bathroom, you would have 1 men's bathroom to 3 women's bathrooms. Now, if you are stuck in dualism and you're counting drops and you see this, you think, oh, that's not fair. They're getting special rights. They're getting special privileges. I don't get it. You know, I feel discriminated against. Look, they're taking over. And that's the language that's going to come out of any place that's seeing it from a dualistic linear perspective, from a place of equality but not equity. And that's a really important distinction to begin to make. And this is why context matters so much. If we can't assess the context. And so when, Joy, you ask, don't I need to learn everyone else's cultural context? And sometimes people will ask me in a workshop, does that mean I have to learn everyone's cultural context? And then I will say yes. But before your eyes glaze over, I like to think of it a little bit as like learning to drive. So I don't know how many of you remember getting behind the wheel the first time. I certainly do. You know, little tiny white Toyota Carina. They don't even make that model anymore. I remember getting behind the wheel. My dad, my very, very brave father, got in the passenger side, and I said, okay, Dad, I'm ready to head out. I need you to watch for the lights and the pedestrians because I'm going to stay focused on the lines. To me, driving was a bunch of disconnected, unrelated events that I couldn't keep track of all of it, And so I needed help, which I think this is a beautiful metaphor for we don't get to do this alone, and we are going to need help, particularly in the early stages. But as we develop some core competencies around making mistakes, around relationship building, around developing our listening skills, around informing ourselves around other cultural contexts, soon driving becomes integrated in a way that we just flow with it. It's no longer isolated things that overwhelm us. It's a way of being. It's a way that we show up on the planet. And so that's why we do need to learn everyone's cultural context. And it's really not as hard as it feels. And the key piece to keep in mind as we're understanding and learning context is that relationships are at the core of it. If we're only learning about other people's cultural context from books or trainings, then more than likely we're going to come away with biases and stereotypes and partial knowledge. And by partial, I mean both biased and only part of the picture. Because of course, we all know as humans we're much more complex than any one element of any part of our identities. And so if I were trying to look at, communicating across difference and why the context matters, I want to give you a couple of very short examples. I remember we were called in to work with a school district. I'll just start with that story. And they couldn't figure out why the teachers were so upset. And it turned out that this principal was having trouble getting the teachers to the teachers meeting on time. And we've done a lot of work in educational contexts of various kinds. This happened to be a school district. And what we have found, and we totally understand this, is that when you get teachers together, almost always they will act out the worst behaviors of their students. So they often will show up late. They'll have side conversations. They'll pass notes. This isn't about teachers. This is about the system. And so, of course, it was showing up in the teachers' meetings. And this principal was really smart, didn't want to be heavy-handed about it, thought it would make most sense to put another teacher sort of in charge of the promptness piece, sort of take the heaviness and the authority part out of it. And she was very conscientious about her role and diligent, and she really did want to make it light. And she had this brilliant idea of going to the library regularly whenever there was going to be a meeting, and she'd look up silly poems on time. And then she put the poem with the time and the date and the place of the meeting, and she'd cut them onto like quarter sheets of colored paper, and then she'd put the notice in each of the teachers' boxes. And so they would have that with a way to be light and playful. So there had been most recently an upset because there had been a poem put on a colored piece of paper, something, I only heard it once, but something like, don't be silly, don't be lazy, be on time, or you're crazy. But it basically had the concepts of silly, lazy, and crazy in there. And then on the little piece of paper at the bottom, the teacher put a picture of a Mexican sleeping under a cactus. Now, for some of you you won't understand this, and that's okay. For some of you, you will instantly understand why that would be offensive. And when the teacher who passed out these reminders showed up to the meeting, and a number of teachers were really upset, she was genuinely mortified. She really, she heard them. She felt horrible that they'd been hurt in such a way. She apologized. And then she went home that night, and then she came back to school the next day, and then she was really angry herself. And she called out a special meeting of the teachers, and she said, I went home and I thought about it, and I thought about it, and I thought about it. And I've decided that you people are making mountains out of molehills. You're looking for trouble, because I myself am an immigrant. And I would never hurt immigrant people. Oh my gosh. In fact, I thought about it, if it was a picture of a Russian, I'm from Russia. If it was a picture of a Russian sleeping under a cactus, I wouldn't have been upset at all. So I'll let that sink in for just 10 seconds. Why would she not be upset about an image of a Russian sleeping under a cactus connected with lazy and crazy? Because there's no historical context to make that image offensive. Now, if it were an image of a Russian with a bottle of vodka, perhaps drunk under a lamppost, or some stereotypical image of a Russian, she would find that hugely offensive, because the context matters. And it's going to be important for us to learn and understand various contexts. And also important that when it's not your context, you defer to the expertise of the group for whom it is their context. The last example I want to give about context here is about getting a cup of coffee. if you have no power imbalance, then you can't have oppression. The way that oppression shows up and dominance is around power imbalances. So let's say we have two men here, and we're going to just take away all other ways in which there might be power imbalances. We're just going to talk strictly around sex. So one male asks another male, go get me a cup of coffee, or could you get me a cup of coffee? It could be a demand, it could be a request. It doesn't matter. And the reason it doesn't matter what the response is or what the request is because there's no imbalance of power. However, if a male says that to a female, it crosses a line and it becomes sexism. No, females are not making mountains out of molehills. We are not oversensitive, and we are not looking for trouble. It became sexism. Given the history of the context of the oppression of females, go get me a cup of coffee crossed a line. And that's important to remember. At the same time, if you and I have a relationship as a female and a male, I would love nothing more than to get you a cup of coffee if it works for me and you make the request. Or if it doesn't work for me and we have the relationship, then we can talk about it and I can get mad at you and you can listen and we can figure it out together. And that is why, while there are various guidelines, and this is the part in the introduction where we talk about people looking for techniques and recipes, there is no technique or recipe. There's relationships, intimate, authentic relationships, and there's context and understanding the context. And within those two lie your best chance at creating justice. That's your best hope in my experience. So I want to go ahead and move to the next and final stage, which is a time for questions and reflection. We've given ourselves about 15 minutes for this, and we're going to eventually get to some reflection questions, but I want to first start, if you can help formulate your questions in terms of clarification questions, like what concept didn't make sense, any place that you'd want to review some of the teaching, so that we're first on the same page around that, and then we'll ask a couple of questions for reflection.
Great. Thank you, Nancy. How compelling, my goodness, just seeing the nuanced weaving of the dynamics and the frameworks and the impacts of, racism and the other institutional oppressions. And this should really galvanize us into doing, internal work. So,
thank you.
Are you going to read out the first question that you have? So folks, we do have some questions, general questions from people, but this is something that if there are any clarifications you still need on Perry's model, this is a very good time to send in your questions. And I'm going
to go ahead and prompt the next question, Kinkini, even as we'll take those just in case. So the first reflection question was something about what was surprising to you about this model. So if you're beyond clarification and we don't have clarification, let's see if we can expose or discuss a little bit about something that was surprising to you.
We have a couple of folks talking about, that the cultural identity of whites, that's like an aha thing that, often a day goes by and you're not thinking about, culture in the way that other communities do, and that hole or that void that needs to be filled was an aha for some.
I'm so glad. I know that was some of the most profound work for me, watching Lillian lead a particular experiential exercise that we do in our trainings and that I do now, is really working with white people to reclaim a sense of home and belonging. And I don't see that work happening in any other workshops or trainings or even perspectives, that until white people can find a place of home and belonging, they can't be solid allies to any group across racism. And that idea came from Dr. Erica Sherver-Marcuse. That was the basis of her work, which she started some 40 years ago now. So that was something that was surprising. Also, maybe how does your dualism impact your ability to listen or understand people from other cultural contexts? That's another question we thought we might reflect on together. And we know, I'm sure when we were describing what dualism is, I'm sure there were like a million examples of people you know who are dualistic. I think one of the biggest challenges is for us to recognize where we are dualistic.
And we are getting questions about that, is that, you know, not about dualism in particular, but do people shift back and forth? If you go forward, do you also end up going back? And, you know, how can you be in one state for one part of your life and another for another part of your life? And as you said, you move from state to state during the day, course of the day, but go ahead.
The course of the day, yes, exactly, minute by minute, unfortunately. And a lot of it has to do with fear. I mean, where we're having greater elements of stress or frustration or a fear of failure or even competency. I mean, they're just, they don't even have to be connected to oppression, but we become more oppressive based on the fear-based need to protect ourselves. And so the more, and you can see the power of these fear narratives in our society today, if we're just looking at the U.S. context, but globally as well, it really, that fear is what has people going into much more rigid and dualistic perspectives and positions, and from a place of protection rather than from a place of safety and understanding. And so we can see the dynamics of fear showing up all over the place. But what's wonderful is just to gauge for yourself on a minute-by-minute basis, where are you either letting go of fear and or pulling fear closer in a way to protect yourself? And how is that dualism impacting your capacity to be flexible, to be relaxed, to hear and connect with people who are so different from us?
Thank you, Nanci. And lots of great insights. Anne says that, you know, challenge is another way to kind of reframe the fear that they have. The challenge is to be able to, you know, see different points of view. Kay says the first reaction from dualism seems to anger arises from people. There's a lot of anger that, and how do you cope with that, like in your, when you're dealing with dualism?
Yes. So there's another model that we often explore in tandem with this one, because I think this kind of lays out what the language is, I hope, for the dynamic. And then the second model really addresses how we work through the fear and anger responses that we're having ourselves. When we get hooked, if you would, I think of it as like a hooking experience. Someone comes at it dualistically, and then we end up responding dualistically, and then we're like this, we're hooked on each other. And so the key in any dynamic where there's two people hooking is, how do we begin to let go and unhook? And really, this work of letting go and unhooking is about us doing healing work for what we call emotional healing work and releasing. There was what we know about human beings is that we feel before we think. And until we get a safe place to feel our feelings, we're not going to be able to move to that committed relativism place and begin to make that assessment. So of course it's absolutely legitimate, it's absolutely understandable that our first response is going to be one of anger, right? Someone just said something to us that feels threatening, that's upsetting, that's demeaning or disrespectful or frightening. And so our response is going to be a human feeling response. That is understandable. The problem is when we have that human feeling response in front of someone who's already in fear base. So then you just have more feeling on top of more feeling, and no one's thinking in that dynamic. So what does this mean for us? It means that we need to create, develop, protect, and nurture spaces and frameworks for us to let our feelings out. And this is the challenge in a society that devalues feelings. We live in a society where the purpose is to be as numb as possible, where we can get access to numbing behaviors, whether it's shopping on Amazon, like 24 hours a day, instant gratification, whether it's screen time, whether it's, you know, hours and hours in front of Facebook and social media, or it's television and movies, whether we're talking about ways to numb out with alcohol, food, drugs, sugar. I think that this is really crucial, that we understand that this work is about unnumbing. It's really about how to create places to feel. And you know, some people will say to me, I was like, well, I just don't feel good when we do this. And what I want to say is, no, we're not going to feel good, but we're going to feel something. And feeling is the victory. The key is, how do we not just feel all over the place, but really create places for us to feel, knowing that our feelings are not who we are. They're valid and understandable, and we need a place to heal from them, but they're not a guide to action. And that we can find compassion for ourselves and for others who disagree with us if we can get a place to discharge and do that healing work. And so that's really the core of the work, of the approach that we do, is a racial healing framework. And the healing is both for us as individuals to be better allies, but also how to do that across group.
Thank you, Nanci. And I know we have 5 minutes, but we have so many questions that I'm hoping that we can go a little bit over and answer a few questions, if that's okay with you and with our. So Debbie asked, like, do you think faith-based communities might be more tending towards the dual, might be fostering the culture of duality a little bit more? Does faith sometimes make one more in that state?
It's funny. I think it's very tempting to put religion or political party on dualism, and I'm going to say that no one's cornered the market on dualism. I think one of the saddest things to me is to watch just as much dualism and rigidity and fear-based responses coming out of a political left, and people who are non-religious as people who are religious. And I remember we were doing this workshop at a Catholic university, and someone was really, using scripture to really point to dualism and why dualism and fear was, to have fear of God, and that was correct. And I remember this one minister, or I think he was, I don't know if he was a priest, but he was certainly religious, turned to he said, "Look, Larry, Jesus was a committed relativist, for goodness sake. Love the sinner, but not the sin." That's a beautiful example of committed relativism. So I think it's important for us to steer away from trying to categorize any one group or way of being. What we're really wanting to look at is, where is fear running through any of these movements, whether it's religious or political or educational or, business. Fear is going to be your issue here, not groups or categories of people. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Nanci. Another question, Kathleen asks, I'm concerned that this model might suggest to white people that it's white people against others, and the examples are, between white allies or white and different cultures, different races. How might we use, so that's part one of that, okay. That's the comment, and the second is how might we use this model to explain dualism within same, cultures and within the same gender and race as well.
Absolutely. So I think the first one is, I'm using the race example because my bias is that my work is about eliminating all oppressions, but I take a racial equity lens because I believe that that's the thread on the blanket of oppression I want to pull on to unravel the blanket. I also think because of our historical context as USers, it seems to be the issue we have the hardest time talking about as a community, with dignity, with respect, with understanding. There's so much polarization happening. So I hope that this model does not reinforce that polarizing, and it would make sense that it might be heard in a polarizing way, because I think that speaks to how little space and room and shared framework and language we have to have some of these conversations. So it's not at all what I would intend, and I can understand, and I apologize if that's been the impact for you or others in this conversation today. I think in terms of applying this model within group, it's not dissimilar. Of course, within a group, you're still going to have power imbalances. So that's the tricky part, right? So even if we're within the same group, whether it's whites with whites or women with women, there's going to be power imbalances. And it's where the power imbalances play out and fear is present. And always there's going to be, that dominance and subordination. People will say to me, "Oh, you get a bunch of different people together and you're going to have conflict." And I say, that's nonsense. Difference is interesting and curious to us. And just watch young people and you'll see that. The place where you're going to have conflict is when difference has power attached to it that's dominant and subordinates another experience. And so that process of subordinating, whatever the intersection of dominance is where you're going to get pushback. People wanting to be respected, have dignity in their frame of reference, be valued for how they move in the world and what they've contributed, that's where you're going to see potentially this pushback. So the model does apply within any group. The places that we want to look at is where is the access of power, and I don't mean access ACCESS, but access AXIS. So where is there a power differential? That's one group is dominant and one group is subordinate, and what fear is operating. And so if you have those two elements, regardless of the interaction, whether it's interpersonal or intergroup or interorganizational or international, that's what we're looking at here.
Terrific. So much of this is really that kind of deep internal work that we first need to do within ourselves. And I have a, clarification from Debbie, who says that the question wasn't that religion promotes dualism, but maybe religion really helps us to define our culture in many ways too. So thank you for that.
Very important clarification.
Very
I misunderstood the question.
Clarification, and I apologize for interpreting that differently. But we have a cluster of questions from folks who do a lot of convening and coalition building, and they are looking for some kind of markers or way in which, when you're working with a group of stakeholders and co-creating things together, and you're stuck in more moving out of the committed relativism to contextual, like how do you kind of, shepherd if you're in the facilitator role or in that process? What are some ways that you, see signs of folks being in the contextual rather than in the committed, and how do you kind of move the group?
Well, I mean, I want to make sure, so I would need to ask you, what is the group, what is the makeup of the group? Is the contextual movement, is it around race in particular? Are there other elements that you want me to address? So I need a little bit more information on that. And I would say that, how often are you convening this group? How often is this group getting together? What are the relationships that have been built or established? Is it a one-off? Is it you meet every week? That type of situation. So if you have a kind of recurring group, I'm just going to go with that. You have a recurring group that you convene, and the participants are relatively consistent, and you've been together over a period of time. That's going to give you a lot more room as a convener or facilitator to perhaps identify some of this, these dynamics, and give you some safety to take some risks. And I think it's going to be important to know that you're going to make mistakes and you're not going to get it right. And if you are the convening person, you do have a responsibility to recognize some of these dynamics. It might be that it's a conversation off to the side. It might be sharing with them this webinar and giving them a language to talk about it. I recommend as much as possible to inoculate for the dynamic before it happens, so that when it happens, you can call it out without making anyone feel like you've personally attacked them. So that's just an internal, if you would, like facilitator trainer trick. And an inoculation is exactly what it sounds like. So you anticipate what's going to play out and you say it before it shows up. So for example, when Lily and I would work with teachers, we would say before the training would start, we know there's going to be a temptation for you to act out some of those behaviors that your students do, and then we'd get the teachers to tell us the behaviors that their students did, right? So, oh yeah, they are always passing notes, or they're having side conversations, or they come back late from break, da 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 da. So then when we saw these patterns show up in the group, we could help them see that it was an effect of the institution on them, not a personal, like you're not committed, or you're lazy, or you're not keeping track of time, or you're not being professional, all the places that really cut at someone's competency. So I would encourage you to take a few, take some time to really think at what are some of the traps or places where you're seeing these behaviors recur over and over and over again. Can you get the group to identify them in a way that is safe? Or if you're going to have a one-on-one conversation, can you get them to name them and then ask them to help for help? Like have them be like, oh yeah, I can see where that behavior is going to come up. Can you help me when it shows up? Can we have like a code word or something so I can know offline? Or if the group's able to identify it, what are some ways that the group wants to address it when it comes up? So that's the beautiful thing about the facilitative model and convening model. I hope that those are helpful ideas.
Thank you, Nancy. And those questions you asked were perfect facilitator questions, like, is this, race-based? And you answered that in such, comprehensive way. So we have many, many, many comments saying how fabulous this session was, and if they can go, go back and access that. So
Wow.
thank you again, and I'm going to give the last word to Sarah. Again, like as you said, if we are to be making systems level changes to co-create a more just first food field, like relationships are at the core of what we do, and by focusing simply on policy and structural change without the internal work, we may inadvertently even enable the systems of oppression that's happening. And Sarah says this best when she says, what was surprising to me that I'm still turning over in my mind is the idea of deep listening being so similar to love, how our work is so much stronger when rooted in love.
Oh,
So with that,
that's beautiful.
thank you again. It's been such an honor, and thank you for our participants. We will continue the conversation on the discussion forum. Please, please join the learning community. Let's keep this moving forward. And thank you to Nancy and to you all. Until next time.
Thank you, Kinkini, and thank you to the U.S. Breastfeeding Committee for making this available, this opportunity to share this information.
Thank you again, and the recording will be uploaded this afternoon, late evening, and you will be able to access all of it at your convenience as many times as you want to. So thanks, everybody.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.